Your vacation problems are your problems. You should have read the fine print. The manager's voice oozed with smug indifference through the phone, just before the click and the deadening silence of the dial tone. He thought he was talking to just another angry customer, another insignificant family he could swat away like a fly. He didn't know he was talking to a man who had spent 10 years in the PR industry, building and destroying reputations for a living. And in that moment, standing in a hotel room that smelled of mold and shattered dreams, I had just found my new project, the complete and utter annihilation of his company. But before that phone call, before the cold, calculated rage set in, there was a dream. Let me paint you a picture. For 3 long years, my wife Sarah, our 7-year-old daughter Lily, and I had been saving for this. This wasn't just a vacation, it was the vacation. It was the reward for every overtime shift I pulled, every date night we skipped, every time we said no to some small pleasure because we were putting every spare dollar into the Paradise Fund. The company was called Elysian Escapes, and their brochure was a masterpiece of deception. It showed families laughing in crystal clear infinity pools, couples dining on private balconies under a canopy of stars, and children building magnificent sandcastles on pristine white beaches. For Lily, it was a Bible. She had circled the picture of the Mermaid Kids Club so many times, the paper had worn thin. She talked about it for months, telling her friends she was going to a real-life castle by the sea. This was the moment everything changed for us. If you've ever felt cheated, ignored, and utterly powerless against a faceless corporation, you're in the right place. This is the story of how they took everything from my family. So I took everything from them. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss a single chapter of how this unfolds. The day we arrived should have been magical. After a long flight, we took a taxi from the airport, the air thick with the promise of salt and sun. We drove for what felt like an eternity, leaving the polished tourist areas behind and venturing down increasingly neglected roads. A knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach, but I kept smiling for Sarah and Lily. The best places are always hidden away, I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. Then the taxi pulled up to the entrance. The grand archway from the brochure was there, but it was stained, with chunks of plaster missing. The vibrant, welcoming sign for Elysian Escapes was faded and peeling, one letter hanging on by a thread. The lobby was a ghost of its former self. The majestic fountain in the center was dry, filled with dead leaves and trash. The air, instead of the fresh, floral scent we'd imagined, was heavy with the smell of damp and chlorine. The receptionist, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, barely made eye contact as he handed us a keycard. There was no welcome drink, no warm greeting, just a tired sigh and a gesture down a dimly lit hallway. My heart began to sink, but the worst was yet to come. We walked down the hallway, the threadbare carpet squishing slightly under our feet. I unlocked the door to our Ocean View Deluxe suite, and a wave of stale air hit us. The ocean view was a sliver of gray water, visible between a dumpster and a concrete wall. The king-sized bed was two smaller, lumpy mattresses pushed together, covered with a questionable bedspread. There was a dark, spreading stain on the ceiling, and the sliding door to the balcony was jammed shut with rust. I forced it open with my shoulder, revealing a tiny concrete slab with two filthy plastic chairs. This wasn't paradise. This was a place where joy came to die. I turned around and saw the final crushing blow. Lily, my bright, bubbly daughter, stood in the middle of the room, her little unicorn backpack slipping from her shoulder. Her eyes, which had been sparkling with excitement just an hour ago, were wide with confusion and disappointment. She looked at the peeling wallpaper, the cracked floor tiles, and the dead insects on the windowsill. Then she looked up at me, her lower lip trembling, and asked the question that broke my heart into a million pieces. "Daddy, is this the right castle?" She dropped her brand new mermaid doll on the grimy floor, its shiny tail landing in a patch of dust. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just about the money. This was personal. This was about a promise I had made to my little girl, a promise that Elysian Escapes had turned into a cruel joke. That was when I started making the phone calls. And that's when I heard the voice of the man who had no idea he'd just declared war. The first phone call was an exercise in futility. I was put on hold for 45 minutes, listening to a cheerful, looping jingle that felt like a personal insult. When I finally reached an agent, I got a scripted apology and a promise that a guest satisfaction specialist would call me back within the hour. No one called. I tried again. This time I was told the issue had been escalated. It was corporate speak for being thrown into a black hole from which no complaint ever returns. Every call was the same. A maze of automated menus and agents who were trained to sound empathetic while doing absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, we were living in that nightmare of a room. We couldn't leave. We had poured every last cent into this trip and had nowhere else to go. Sarah tried her best to make it an adventure for Lily, creating games and telling stories, but I could see the strain behind her smile. Lily had become quiet. She didn't want to go to the pool, which was just a murky pit with a closed for maintenance sign that looked like it had been there for years. The so-called beach access was a path overgrown with weeds that led to a rocky, dirty shore. The dream had completely died, replaced by a grim reality we had to endure for 7 days. On the third day, after dozens of calls, I finally managed to bully my way up to a senior manager. This was the man from the first call, the one who would eventually light the fuse. His name was Davis. He listened to my entire story with an air of profound boredom. I sent him the pictures I had taken on my phone, the black mold spreading in the bathroom, the exposed wires near the bed, the view of the dumpsters. I described my daughter's tears. I thought naively that a human being on the other end would have to respond. He didn't. Instead, he coolly informed me that I had agreed to the terms and conditions when I booked. He said the photos in their brochure were for illustrative purposes only, and that the company was not responsible for my subjective interpretation of their marketing materials. He spoke in a calm, condescending tone, designed to make me feel irrational and foolish. "Sir," he said, his voice dripping with false patience, "we provide a service. If your expectations were not met, that is unfortunate, but it is not a breach of contract." He made it sound like I was the one at fault for believing their lies. That was their strategy. It wasn't just about refusing a refund, it was about psychological warfare. They were trained to wear you down, to make you feel so small and helpless that you would eventually just give up. After he hung up on me, I sat on the edge of the lumpy bed in complete silence. The anger I felt was no longer hot and explosive. It was becoming something different, colder, sharper. I looked at the contract on my laptop, the 20 pages of legal jargon designed to protect them from people like me. They had built a fortress of words to hide behind, and I realized then that I couldn't tear it down from the outside. I would have to find a way to get inside and make it collapse on itself. The vacation was a total loss, but my new project was just getting started. We came home to a house that felt too quiet. The excitement that had filled it for weeks was gone, replaced by a heavy cloud of disappointment. We had less money than when we left and a collection of bitter memories. Sarah tried to stay positive for Lily, but I could see the fatigue in her eyes. I felt like a failure. I had promised my family paradise and led them to a desolate tourist trap. For a week, I wallowed in that feeling, going through the motions at my boring desk job, the condescending voice of that manager, Davis, echoing in my head. Then, one night, I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs and sat in the dark, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face. On a whim, I pulled up the Elysian Escapes website again. I saw the same pristine beaches, the same laughing families, the same lies. But this time, I wasn't looking at it as a cheated customer. I was looking at it with different eyes. eyes that had spent a decade on the other side of the curtain. You see, before I took my current stable 9 to 5 job to have more time for my family, I was someone else. I was a senior PR manager for Horizon Resorts, one of the biggest names in the luxury travel industry and the main competitor to companies like Elysian Escapes. My entire job was to understand how the public thinks. I knew how to build a brand into a symbol of trust and luxury, but I also knew how to tear one down. I knew that a company's reputation is a fragile ecosystem, and I knew exactly which parasites could cause it to collapse from within. As I stared at their website, the old instincts began to stir. I wasn't a ghost, but I had a ghost inside me. A ruthless, strategic professional I had put to sleep years ago. Elysian Escapes had just woken him up. I started dissecting their campaign. I saw the cheap stock photos they used, the manipulative language, the carefully worded disclaimers designed by corporate lawyers. I recognized the patterns. They were a company built on a foundation of lies protected by a wall of legal jargon. They felt untouchable, but I knew their weaknesses. They relied on their victims feeling isolated and powerless. They counted on people being too tired or too intimidated to fight back. They built their entire business model on the assumption that 1,000 quiet screams are less dangerous than one loud voice. And that's when the plan began to form in my mind. It started as a flicker and quickly grew into a raging fire. I wasn't just going to get my money back. That wasn't enough. I was going to become their worst nightmare. I was going to take their most powerful weapon, public perception, and turn it against them. They thought they were a fortress. I was about to show them they were a house of cards, and I was the coming storm. The rage was a compass now, and it was pointing me in one direction. The truth. Buried under a mountain of corporate lies? My first move wasn't to blast the company on my own social media. That would be amateur. A single angry post is just noise. It's easily dismissed and quickly forgotten. I needed an orchestra, not a solo. My mission was to find the other victims, the other quiet screams, and unite them into a single deafening roar. I started where every PR professional knows to look for the real dirt, not the polished, easily manipulated review sites, but the dark corners of the, internet. I scoured obscure travel forums, private Facebook groups for vacation fails, and long-forgotten blog comment sections. I was looking for keywords for phrases that matched my own experience. Elysian Escapes, brochure versus reality, refund denied, and the name that had become a curse word in my house, Davis. The digital breadcrumbs were everywhere, forming a trail of broken promises and financial ruin. Then I called in a favor. In my old life, I worked with a tech wizard named Alex, a guy who could pull data from the web like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. I told him the story. He wasn't just sympathetic, he was angry on my behalf. They messed with the wrong guy, he said, a grin in his voice. Let's burn them. Within 24 hours, he sent me an encrypted file. It contained every mention of Elysian Escapes he could find, scraped from every corner of the web, organized and cross-referenced. The file was a gold mine of misery. There were dozens of stories, each one a unique shade of awful, but all painted with the same brush of deception. A young couple whose honeymoon was spent in a room with a cockroach infestation. A family with young kids whose all-inclusive resort had a restaurant that was permanently closed. And then I found the story that made my blood run cold. An elderly couple, the Martins. They had saved for 10 years for a 50th anniversary cruise, only to be given a windowless cabin next to the engine room. Their polite, heartbreaking emails begging for a partial refund were met with the same cold corporate denial we received. I began reaching out one by one. I created a secure, anonymous email address and a simple, encrypted online form. I wasn't just another angry customer, I was an organizer. I explained that I was building a comprehensive case against the company and that our strength was in numbers. The response was a floodgate opening. People sent me everything: photos, videos, screenshots of conversations with customer service, even audio recordings of their own infuriating calls with Davis. A pattern emerged. It was a calculated, repeatable scam. They used the same misleading photos for multiple properties, the same scripts to deny claims, the same strategy to wear people down. This wasn't bad management. This was a criminal enterprise hiding behind a glossy brochure, and I was now holding their entire playbook in my hands. Having an arsenal of evidence was one thing, but how I used it would determine whether I won the war or just lost a battle. If I just dumped all the files online, I'd look like a bitter, obsessed man with a grudge. Elysian Escape's PR team would discredit me in a day. No, I couldn't attack them head on. I needed to build a weapon disguised as a gift. I needed a Trojan horse. And so, Wandering Will was born. I bought a clean, professional looking website template and created social media accounts on every major platform. The persona was simple. Will was an ordinary guy, a family man who is passionate about finding authentic travel experiences and helping others avoid the common tourist traps. I populated the accounts with beautiful, generic travel photos and started writing. My PR background gave me an edge. I knew exactly how to craft a voice that sounded genuine, trustworthy, and relatable. My strategy was all about patience. For the first month, Wandering Will didn't mention a single negative thing. Instead, I did the opposite. I used the information from the forums to find small, family-owned hotels and tour companies that were getting rave reviews from real customers. I wrote glowing, detailed articles about them. I praised their honesty, their customer service, and their charm. I became a champion for the little guy. It worked better than I could have imagined. The small businesses I featured were so grateful for the free publicity that they shared my articles everywhere. My follower count started to climb. People left comments like, "Finally, a travel blogger I can trust." And, "Thanks for being so honest, Will." Every post, every positive review was another plank of wood in my Trojan horse. I was building a platform based on the one thing Elysian Escapes had completely destroyed: trust. Inside, the ghost of my old self, the calculating PR strategist, was running the show. I was creating a trusted source, a community of travelers who believed in Wandering Will. They had no idea that my entire online presence was a carefully constructed trap. They followed me for honest travel advice, unaware that I was slowly leading them to the gates of my enemy. My blog wasn't a passion project, it was a staging ground. And soon the army I had hidden inside its walls would be ready to march. After 2 months, Wandering Will had become a small but respected voice in the online travel community. I had built my foundation of trust, brick by painstaking brick. Now it was time to start the demolition. My attack began not with a cannonball, but with a whisper. I published my first strategically angled article. The title was innocent enough: 5 red flags to spot before booking your next vacation. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression. I never mentioned Elysian Escapes by name. I didn't have to. I simply used their entire business model as a case study for what to avoid. Red flag number 1: illustrative photos only. I explained how companies use stock images or heavily edited photos that don't represent the actual location. As an example, I posted a picture of a beautiful, pristine pool right next to a picture of a murky, neglected one captioned, "What they promise versus what you might get." The second photo was one of the dozens I had collected from other victims. Red flag number 2: vague language and buried fees. I took screenshots of the most deceptive clauses from my Elysian Escapes contract, with the company name blurred out, of course, and explained exactly how they were designed to trap the customer. I was teaching my audience to see the matrix, to recognize the legal architecture of the scam. The comments section exploded. People shared their own horror stories, validating every point I made. My article was being shared in travel forums as a must-read guide. I was arming the public with knowledge, using my enemy's own tactics as the textbook. My next move was even more subtle. I identified a handful of small, ambitious YouTube travel bloggers, creators who were hungry for a scoop that would make their channel stand out. I created another anonymous email address and became their secret source. To the first blogger, I sent a simple tip. You might want to investigate the customer review scores for Elysian Escapes. They seem to have a lot of one-star reviews that disappear mysteriously. To another, I sent a couple of the most damning photos I had, with the message, "A source sent me these," supposedly from the Paradise Resort run by Elysian Escapes. I gave each of them a different breadcrumb. I wasn't telling them what story to write. I was just planting a seed and letting their own journalistic curiosity do the rest. I was invisible, a ghost in the machine, starting fires all over the forest at once. They didn't know the tips were all coming from the same person. All they knew was that something rotten was brewing at Elysian Escapes, and they wanted to be the first to expose it. The whispers were starting. The doubt was taking root. The ground was now perfectly prepared for a bombshell. The small fires I had started were creating smoke, but I needed an inferno. The whispers and doubts among small-time bloggers were good for laying the groundwork, but they weren't enough to shake a corporate giant. I needed a story so emotionally powerful it couldn't be ignored. It was time to choose my first real domino. Of all the evidence I had collected, the story of the elderly couple, the Martins, was the one that haunted me. It was pure, distilled heartbreak. They weren't just disappointed tourists. They were victims of a profound act of corporate cruelty. 50 years of marriage, a decade of saving every spare dollar for one perfect trip, all to celebrate a lifetime together. And Elysian Escapes had put them in a noisy, windowless box next to the engine room, and then refused to even acknowledge their polite, desperate pleas. Their story was the perfect weapon. It wasn't about a dirty pool or a bad view, it was about dignity and a lifetime of memories being trampled for profit. I knew that this was the story that could turn the tide. I needed to get it into the hands of someone who could make it explode. That's where Jenna Reed came in. I knew Jenna from my old life. She was a freelance investigative journalist, a shark who was always looking for the next big story. She had a reputation for being relentless and for loving a good David versus Goliath fight. More importantly, she had contacts at major online news outlets. I didn't reach out to her as myself. I used one of my anonymous email accounts, posing as a concerned whistleblower from within the travel industry. I didn't just forward her the Martins' emails and photos, I packaged it. Using my PR skills, I created a professional, confidential press kit. I wrote a compelling one-page summary, created a timeline of events, and highlighted the most heartbreaking quotes from their letters. I attached the high-resolution photos of their cramped, miserable cabin and the screenshots of the glossy, luxurious suite they were promised. I did all the work for her. I made the story not just compelling, but easy. I sent the email with the subject line, "Tip: How a multi-million-dollar travel company robbed a couple of their 50th anniversary." I hit send and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Her reply came back in less than 5 minutes. It was only 3 words, but they were the 3 words I had been waiting for. I'm on it. The domino was pushed. Jenna's article landed like a grenade. It was published on a major online news portal, and within hours, it was everywhere. The story of the Martins was the emotional core. It was simple, tragic, and infuriating. People weren't just reading it, they were feeling it. It was shared by tens of thousands of people, the comments section a waterfall of fury directed at Elysian Escapes. The company's initial response was a clumsy, generic corporate statement about looking into the matter, which only added fuel to the fire. They thought it was one isolated story that they could weather. They were wrong. For 24 hours, I let Jenna's story dominate the conversation. I watched from the shadows as the pressure built. Then I made my move. On my Wandering Will blog, I published a new post. The title was a carefully crafted piece of bait. The Elysian Escapes Scandal. What if the Martins aren't the only victims? I started the post with praise for Jenna's journalism. Then I dropped the bomb. Like many of you, I wrote, I was horrified by what I read. I began to wonder if this was a case of one terrible mistake or a pattern of behavior. So I started digging. I used my platform to ask a simple question, and the answers I received are chilling. This was the moment the Trojan horse opened its gates. I unleashed everything. I embedded a link to a dedicated page on my blog, a page I had been preparing for weeks. It was a library of their crimes. There were photo galleries comparing their brochure images to the disgusting reality. There was an interactive map showing the locations of their nightmare resorts. And most damningly, there was an audio section with clips of their customer service agents, including the infamous Davis, using the exact same condescending scripts to dismiss victim after victim. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. My blog post acted as the key that unlocked the full scope of the scandal. The small bloggers I had previously tipped off now had a mountain of credible, verified evidence to support their own stories. They linked to my investigation, and the story mutated. It was no longer just about one elderly couple. It was about a systemic, predatory business model. The hashtag I created, my Elysian Nightmare, started trending. My phone didn't stop buzzing. Every major news outlet that had covered Jenna's story was now running updates, citing the bombshell investigation by travel blogger Wandering Will. I had become the anonymous source and the public hero at the same time. The storm was no longer gathering. It had broken, and Elysian Escapes was at its center with nowhere to hide. The fallout was a corporate bloodbath, and I had a front row seat. Elysian Escapes' stock price plummeted so fast it looked like a cliff dive. Their social media pages were a smoldering ruin of angry comments and one-star reviews. Major booking sites were suspending their listings. The story was no longer just a viral scandal. It was a full-blown financial catastrophe. They were hemorrhaging money and credibility by the hour, and I felt a cold, quiet satisfaction watching the empire of lies burn. Then, exactly as I predicted, they made their final desperate move. They released a public apology video. It featured their CEO, a man named Thompson, sitting in a sterile boardroom, looking directly into the camera with the soulless eyes of a man reading a script written by a team of panicked lawyers. He talked about falling short of their values and taking these concerns very seriously. It was a textbook example of a non-apology, filled with empty corporate jargon and carefully crafted to avoid any admission of legal guilt. They thought this video would calm the storm. They were wrong. As soon as their video went live, so did I. On my Wandering Will YouTube channel, I started my first ever live stream. I didn't show my face. I just shared my screen, with their apology video paused in the center. Thousands of people flooded in within minutes. "Hello, everyone," I began, my voice calm and steady. "Elysian Escapes has just released a statement. I used to write statements like this for a living. Let's break it down together, shall we?" And for the next 15 minutes, I performed a live autopsy on their lies. I paused the video every few seconds to dissect the CEO's words. When he said, "We are sorry for any guest who felt their experience was not up to our standards," I cut in. "Notice the word felt," I explained. "This is classic PR deflection. They aren't apologizing for their actions. They are apologizing for your feelings. They are subtly blaming you for having the wrong feelings about being scammed." When he promised an internal review, I laughed. This means they will investigate themselves and shockingly find they did nothing wrong. It's a tactic to delay and deflect until the public forgets. I played the audio clips of Davis side by side with the CEO's promises of respectful customer service. The contrast was devastating. The live chat was a waterfall of validation and outrage. My work was done. The public saw the apology for the hollow, manipulative performance it was. By the next morning, the news was no longer just about their past scams, but about their dishonest apology. A major law firm announced it was organizing a class action lawsuit on behalf of the victims. Within a week, Thompson, the CEO, resigned. The company was in a death spiral. I sat back, closed my laptop, and for the first time in months, I felt the heavy knot of anger in my chest finally begin to dissolve. The war was over. I had won. It took 6 more months for the last piece of the domino puzzle to fall. The news came quietly, not with a bang, but with a sterile press release. Elysian Escapes, crippled by the class action lawsuit, and a reputation so toxic it was radioactive, filed for bankruptcy. The fortress had crumbled into dust. The name that had caused my family so much pain was now just a footnote in business history, a cautionary tale for companies that believe they are untouchable. Through the lawsuit, we, along with hundreds of other families, received a settlement. It wasn't a lottery win, but it was more than enough to cover what we had lost. More importantly, it was an admission, a final legal acknowledgement of their deception. We took that money and booked another trip. This time, there were no glossy brochures or impossible promises. We rented a small, simple cabin by a lake, a place recommended by a family friend. And that vacation? It was perfect. I watched Lily, not in a grimy, neglected hotel, but splashing freely in the clear lake water, her laughter echoing through the trees. I saw Sarah sitting on the porch, a genuine, relaxed smile on her face, the stress of the past year finally melting away. There was no kids' club or fancy restaurant. There was just us. We spent our days hiking and our nights telling stories around a crackling campfire. It was real, and it was everything I had wanted for them in the first place. Returning home, I knew I couldn't go back to my old life. I couldn't sit at a desk crunching numbers when I knew there were other families out there, just like mine, being crushed by corporate machines. The wandering will persona had started as a tool for revenge, but it had become something more. It had become a symbol of hope for the little guy. So I took the biggest risk of my life. I quit my stable job and officially launched a consulting firm, a legitimate one this time. I help ordinary people navigate disputes with dishonest companies. I translate the fine print, organize collective complaints, and teach them how to make their voices heard. My daughter's dream was stolen by a company that believed it was above consequences. In fighting for her, I found a new purpose for myself. I tore down a corrupt empire built on lies, not with anger alone, but with the truth. I took their system and used its own weight to bring it crashing down. So now I have to ask you, did I go too far? Or was this a justified response to a company that preyed on families like mine? What would you have done in my place? Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more stories about justice, revenge, and the little guy fighting back, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below with your thoughts. I read every single one.